Hello, everyone. Here to talk about DevOps mindset. My name is Hernandez. I'm currently a senior engineering manager for Google Cloud, specializing in developer tools. I'm not actually here to talk about Google specifically, but I have spent 25 years plus helping developers, writing tools, helping with processes, a lot of which Google and other companies have adopted successfully, not necessarily because of me, in order to have successful products. So a quick recap, the bad old days, which some companies still do, unfortunately. You have a business idea, you write a PRD, development thinks about it for a while, does a design spec, starts writing some code, hands it off to the build engineers hand it back until it compiles. Once it compiles, it gets sent to QA, QA hands it back till it works. Once it works, it gets sent to Ops. Ops sends it back until they can deploy it. Finally, you get it out to production, and hopefully your customers are making use of this. This can take a really long time. When I got into industry, 18 months to 24 months was the standard development lifecycle. Thankfully, that is no longer the case for the most part. But this also led to a really awesome, my favorite internet meme, Ops problem now. All that constant throwing things over the wall. It's like, well, I'm done. Number one thing you hear is a build release engineer. It worked on my machine, right? How many of you have heard this or said it? So this is bad. We don't want to do this, right? We want to bring ideas to market faster. What does that mean? It means that we want to go from weeks, months, years to days or hours or days. How do we do this? Well, Martin Fowler and crowd back in the day came up with the Agile Manifesto. Sometime later, the Belgian guys came up with the idea of DevOps, which is how do you implement Agile. That's really what we're talking about here. It's the adoption of Agile through the implementation of DevOps. The Agile Manifesto technically has 12 principles. Most people boil them down to these 4 general categories. Individual interactions really means you're empowering your development teams. Spotify had a great little animated thing that explained how they implemented this that was super cute. But it really means that you're providing a lot more flexibility within your development environment. Working software over comprehensive documentation. When I got in the industry, the technical writers wrote docs based on the business spec. And then part of the analysis on whether or not your product was ready to go was comparing the functionality of the working product against the documentation. That's no good. That does not allow for flexibility. Don't get me wrong, documentation is amazing, but in the modern world, this means an emphasis of developer documentation supporting docs more as like a GitHub markdown than having developers spend a whole lot of time in something like Confluence or another complex content management system. Right? Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. The customer, as we often know, may not know what it is that they want. So you can spend months and months in contract negotiations outlining what you're going to deliver, and at the end of it, it may not actually be successful. Active engagement, early vetting, early access, alphas. This is what is going to end up with the customer getting the result that they want. And then finally, responding to change over following a plan. Planning is great. You should all do lots of planning. And then you should throw the plan out when it's clear that it's not working. And that's really what that is. It's like you have to adapt to change. You've just sent an early alpha to your customer. They don't like it. You talk about something else. Now you're changing the plan, right? Rigid adherence is a bad thing. So what is DevOps on top of that? So cross-functional community of practice is the emphasis here, right? Cross-functional being the key word. We get rid of those walls. We no longer want to have those walls. Everybody is responsible for the delivery of the product according to Agile principles. Boils down into 3 main categories. In stack order, number 1, organizational culture. Supported by technical practices and supported globally by management practices. If you do not have all of these things, you will not be successful. This is what you get out of it. DevOps principles in action. Enable engineering teams to frequently release new features and services safely. Okay? That is your ultimate when you have a successful DevOps implementation. And here's the punchline to all of this. Oops, one back. It is estimated by a couple of different organizations that between 78 and 90% of companies that attempt a DevOps change in their organization will fail in the next 5 years. Up to 90%. You've just spent a whole lot of effort and probably money to fail. Why would you do that? In many cases, it's because you have failed at the first principle, which is organizational culture. So let's look at some cultures. This is Westrom's model of organizational culture. If you Google this, not just because I work at Google, you can use Bing if you want to, you will find this chart in various forms. And it really talks about, I think, in really good ways, what it is that you're looking at. On the left is bad. And you can think about how many companies you've worked at where this is the culture that you have. I particularly like Messenger's shot. Hopefully they weren't actually shot, but imagine, drawing straws as who's going to give the director the bad news. This is bad, right? What you want to move towards is generative. Generative culture is the way you want to go. This is the epitome of a DevOps culture in action, right? Let's talk about how to get there. So leadership must grant autonomy. This is very important. If your executive team does not buy into this, don't start. You're going to fail, right? Waterfall is the way to death. Autonomy, in turn, gives you trust and fosters communication, right? If you're going to be the messenger who's shot, you're not going to be the one who's ready to communicate. If messengers are trained, bridging is encouraged, failure leads to inquiry, you're absolutely going to be the messenger because you're trying to solve the problem, and you know that you have the support to do that. More specifically, thanks guys, right? Leadership establishes and clearly communicates the goals. This is where we want to get. Then get out of the way, right? The individual teams will tell you how to get there. And in the process, they're going to be communicating what they're doing so that they can get the feedback to course correct against the original plan, right? Remove roadblocks. If it takes you weeks in order to go through a release cycle and get sign-off from, I don't even know how many dozens of people that are required to sign off a product, you're not engaging in a DevOps culture. It means you have not put in place the culture and infrastructure necessary so that you don't have to go through that manual process. You need to keep the rules simple. You may need to change things or implement things to support that. Again, changing the rules if they are obstacles. You need that flexibility and empowerment. Letting the team prioritize what is good for customers, even if it means bending the rules. Great example, if you're a SaaS company and the customers are being impacted something, you're going to hot patch that sucker, right? You're going to want to try and do it in a way that is very safe, but you're not going to want to spend weeks negotiating how you're going to get this thing deployed. Your customers are paying for it now. And then finally, very important, a culture of learning through reviews and retrospectives. At Google, we call this the blameless postmortem. This goes back to, are the messengers shot, right? In Twitter, sometimes you'll see something called hashtag hug ops. I'll give you a great example. A couple of years ago, some poor bastard in US East accidentally took out S3 in the whole region, gone, down, right? Imagine being the person who did that. So the rest of us who are in the systems engineering world started sending hug ops to this person, offering to buy them beers, because first of all, it wasn't actually their fault. Even if they pushed the button or typed the script that led to S3 being down, why in the hell was that process in place that allowed that failure to happen? That was a failure of technology, right? And we wanted to show the world that a good DevOps principle means you're going to figure out why what that person did broke it and fix it. It's not about firing that person because they were the ones who erroneously pushed that button, right? That in turn leads to that person probably leading the way to, let's make sure I never do that again. Technical term being idiot proofing. I have been an idiot a lot, so I'm really, really about that term. Oops, hang on. Where am I? Right, okay. So the bottom line is, there's two main things you want to look at. Throughput and stability. Within that encompasses the entirety of what DevOps ultimately gives you. Throughput is, how fast can your developers get their job done? Stability is, how good is the experience for your customers? How fast can you fix things? what's the change fail rate, which describes how good your quality is. You want your change fail rate to go down, you want your time to restore service to go down, but you want the amount of product that you're pushing through to customers to go up. Intuitively, you think those things are in opposition to each other, but actually they're not if you're doing it correctly. How do you do it correctly? Well, the first thing you have to do is understand what the criteria is for defining success. And here are the signals, right? You have metrics that measure the signals that tell you the results. So deployment frequency, lead time for changes, you can see different rates of teams. This is all, by the way, coming from the State of DevOps report, from the DevOps, from the DORA, which is a great organization, Jez Humble and Nicole Foskren and Gene Kim. They interview companies, lots of surveys, and they tell you, these are the things that elite teams do versus the low-performing teams, right? On-demand deploys per day versus between once a week and a month, right? A month is now really slow, which is funny to me, considering where I came from. Time to restore service, less than an hour. If you're a SaaS company, that's huge. Your customers are going to love you. Change failure rate, 0 to 15% is the ideal target. You can talk about 9s, whatever. Don't fail, right? What do you need to do in order to reduce your fail rate? So here's how not to do it. Because what this is really about is the 78 to 90% who are going to fail. Let's talk about how you might fail and how to avoid it. What are the things you need to avoid? Create a DevOps team. What? First and foremost, DevOps is not a role. DevOps is a culture. DevOps is a way of life. If you're creating a team that's the DevOps team, that team is in for a bad time. You have just made them solely responsible for a massive organizational change with no other buy-in, no other responsibility. It's going to fail. Don't do that. I'm particularly amused in a sort of sad way when I see senior DevOps engineers. Like, what does that even mean? That doesn't exist. Not when DevOps is first and foremost culture. Don't do that. It's something you buy into or you don't. Not factoring cost of change. Over the years, as I've had my teams, I tell them there's 2 rules about supporting your engineering customers. Rule number 1, engineers hate change. It doesn't matter how bad it is, they understand it, they can work with it, they can get their job done, don't touch it. You have to overcome that in order to start implementing a DevOps culture. Rule number 2 is change is hard and expensive. Okay? If you have a stable system, even if it's not giving you the results you want, touching that inherently means risk. So part of adopting a DevOps culture is really understanding what are your goals. And remember, there's 2 emphases that you can focus on. You can focus on both, but it's throughput and stability. Is your problem the amount of product you're trying to drive through, or is your bigger problem how stable your production environment is? One of those 2 is likely probably more important to you. That means the culture changes that you're going to make are going to be in support of that. And that means the metrics and signals that you're looking for to tell you how you're doing need to be around those things. And part of that is, like any other design process, figuring out what it's going to take to meet those goals. And it's going to be expensive. Right? Changing how a company does product delivery is never easy. So you need to remember that. Don't do that. This one, setting unrealistic goals. This goes hand in hand with the last point. If you don't understand what you're trying to achieve, how do you know if you've made it? Right? How do you know if the ROI on it is actually worthwhile? And let's talk about it. Let's think, okay, our problem is that we want to focus on is throughput. How fast we can get stuff out the door. We are a legacy company. We have a very successful product. We're just not getting changes out fast enough to compete. Okay, first thing you have to understand. Let's say your legacy product is Java. Let's say that you're using Oracle as a backend. That's not unreasonable. Lots of companies do that. But if it's a monolithic Java app and has 16 different ways that you're talking to the Oracle database, making your app in and of itself stateful, that's hard. How do you make changes incrementally? You can't, which means you probably have a really long lead time for how often you're making changes. Probably means you have a stabilization time in order to make sure all the bugs are resolved while QA is frantically trying to make sure that the quality is good enough so that you don't have stability problems, right? which means if you want to get faster throughput, you have to think about what it's going to take. First of all, you have to think about what your application and data store relationship is. What needs to change there? How are you going to tear apart key pieces of functionality? Maybe you don't want to go all the way to microservices because you probably don't, but you're definitely going to want to go more than one monolith. What is that cost going to be? You need to go back to your developers and say, what would it take to break out? Just start with the data model, right? What's that cost going to be? Then you can communicate that back up. Because you're not shooting the messenger, what you're doing is you're setting correct expectations. This is a critical part of how you're going to make that change. Many companies will choose not to make that change. Or they'll make that change not understanding the cost, leading to failure. If you're stable enough and you're getting features out reasonably fast enough, you wish it was better, but it's okay, you don't want to do DevOps now. Why would you? The ROI is not there, right? So you really need to understand that and really understand what are you trying to achieve from development all the way up to executive level. So yeah, don't do that. This goes along with the first one, hybrid DevOps. I've seen this a lot too. This usually goes in hand with a DevOps team. Maybe you'll carve out like one little piece, like we're going to experiment with DevOps. I was actually at a place where we tried to do this, and it was an abject failure. Again, DevOps is not a role. DevOps is a culture. If you have not started with the culture, you're going to fail. Because it's going to take incremental changes over time, but everybody needs to be bought into what those changes are and make those incremental changes along with it. You're in or you're out. And if you try to do this hybrid thing, you're going to fail. So elite wins, right? Go back to that chart. If you didn't do the math quickly, you can see kind of the turnover there. The elite teams, 46 times more frequent code deployments, right? I love the 2,604 times faster recovery from failure. That's amazing, right? But do you think that was free? No, that took, well, either the company started from scratch, which is true in some cases, or it took, honestly, probably years of effort. Change is also not fast, in addition to expensive. But more importantly, you can see this other thing. Elite teams, almost 2 times more likely to recommend their team as a great place to work. You have created an empowered group of product development organizations that feel content and inspired and hopefully innovative within their environment because they are supported in that way. One of the ways that Google does this, and other companies too, you know, the 20% projects is a great way to do this. If you're doing well, if your product is doing well, you can spend 1/5 of your time working on something else, right? Talk about incentive, right? Retrospectives. How do you get better if you don't learn from the mistakes? So 1.5 times, I was surprised to see that was actually not higher. Because postmortems often are blame games, pointing fingers, right? Badness, you don't want to do that. So I'm surprised that it wasn't more. But again, the culture is what drives this. There is no technical solution that you can buy that gives you this. And companies will try and sell you this. And they're selling you a line. It's not going to work. So be elite. You say, I love, this is one of my favorite Google sort of slide backgrounds. Be like Google. Google isn't always as elite as we'd like to be because, again, this is an iterative process, constant change. But again, going back to change number 1, what are your actual goals? What are you trying to achieve? And then build your whole transition process around achieving those goals with some of those guidelines along the way. And I wish you the best of luck because once you get it done, it's amazing. But with a 90% failure rate, never think it's easy. Thank you.
Who wishes they could take Tara with them to the next DevOps meeting they have? To do some schooling, excellent. Yeah, we've got some time for questions, if anyone has questions to ask.
Oh, I talked too fast, didn't I?
No, you did fine. If no one else does, I've got a couple I can ask as well, which I've been thinking about as we go through. So, like 90% of people are going to fail doing this, or are going to fail the first time, and possibly the second time. And so, how do you think people are going to recover from the first kind of like DevOps catastrophe as they go through?
Well, again, the way to recover is the way you probably should have done it in the first place, right? You retrospect the first attempt. I've worked at companies where, for example, one team, there are 2 engineering teams, the sort of an infrastructure-y, account management, payment systems as one team, and then another team was the application itself. The infrastructure-y account management team, they had a lot of reasons for wanting to adopt this model because they were sort of the baseline for the rest of it. Account management is pretty critical. If you don't have good account management, it's sort of a non-starter for everything else. That team, within a year, actually went from 7 useful automated tests to almost 5,000. And they went from a 3 to 4 week cycle to multiple times per day. That the team was small enough and the scope was small enough that they did that in a year, but it still took a year. The other team did not adopt this model, and there was tension. The number one tension was, it was assumed that anytime there was a problem, it must be because that other team was releasing too fast. Right? Like, why is that a problem? When they have the data to demonstrate. So there was a real sort of mind share problem that we struggled mightily to try and overcome. You have one team that is using Git, that is heavily invested in automation, unit tests, bare minimum for every pull request. System and integration testing we're kind of lumping them together into end-to-end testing, which is the new description, and that works too, right? All of those things that are absolutely critical. Having micro-ish services that allow you to change things in an isolation, a commitment to an HTTP interface between the various services, right? All of those things that allowed them to make those changes. The other products were fairly monolithic, used Perforce. Like, everything about that sort of organization was fundamentally different. And they never really got to the point while I was there where they were able to make that be a happy marriage. And we kept trying to push, like, hey, look at how cool this is. And like, well, that's not going to work for us. My favorite quote, actually, from the VP of that engineering team, when I was like, dude, the testing, there's not enough testing. He goes, well, how can we write tests if we haven't finished implementing yet? Where do you even start with that, right? I mean, but that, in his experience, that was how you did it. So again, with his belief system, there was no way that team was going to change. It just wasn't going to happen. It started at the top. The culture investment was not ready to be made.
And I think that's one of the hard things that, certainly at F5, we work with a lot of enterprise customers. The Fortune 500 is our happy place. And so a lot of these organizations have traditionally had tight IT controls.
Yes.
You use Perforce, you use the standard thing. I've worked for banks where you have one platform to choose from on one language, and if it didn't fit in that space, tough. And a lot of this, when we see successful companies, they seem to be allowing their teams to use any tool they like. There's this, and so that, I think, as well as the human thing, that tension of like tool sprawl and allowing people to use the technology that they want to use to deliver their teams things is causing people heartache. Do you think that where's your take on like how much freedom you give people in tools and languages they choose to use to deliver?
Right. So that team that I was talking about, the agile-oriented team versus the monolithic team, that was also the team that had to deal with PCI and PII and other regulatory compliance. And it was actually, with that model, easier because they were able to isolate the things that were impacted for regulatory reasons from everything else, right? So that, first of all, let me just call that out. You can do really good security and compliance in a DevOps model. The second thing is, going back to one of the points I made, is understand what your goals are. Right? If the way that I would approach this is, if a developer says, hey, this tool is really cool, I really want to use it, the first question is, what problem are you solving? Right? If this tool is cool just because it's cool, like, okay, you can do that on your own time. Right? If the tool does not contribute to our overall goal that we have clearly communicated as a leadership team, then why would we invest in it? Right, that's the thing that you need to understand is part of that cultural change. Is the developer internalizing that overall culture that says everything is in support of our overall business goals? If you can say, this is going to make my overall developer throughput a lot higher because reasons, go for it, right? If it's like, it's just kind of cool and it might be better than the one we're using now, it's like, you spend a little bit more time investigating that, and then we'll talk, right? So you don't want to shut it down, but you really want to make the developers think about why they're doing it. and to defend it is the key thing.
Thanks. Well, the question. So if you could grab the microphone, then everyone can hear you, or we can repeat the
I really
question.
can't see anything
we
out
can't
there.
see
Your
anything.
eyes are better than mine.
Hello? Oh, okay, not too loud. Great talk. So I get the point about DevOps being a culture, a mindset, something that needs to be driven throughout the organization in order to get buy-off. Imagine you've reached that state. At what point do you talk about a DevOps team, and what does that look like?
Okay, so I have my own biases, and this is a school of thought. I don't like the term DevOps team. I prefer the term, you could call it your infrastructure team, your support team. It gets a little, again, personal bias, it gets a little twitchy if you just describe DevOps as a role. But that's my own bias, and honestly, as long as everybody buys into what that team is doing and understands that collectively there is still that communal sense of responsibility overall, it's fine. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure I answered your question. Okay. And what you call it isn't really not that important, but yes, sir.
Hi, again, thank you. Right. Thank you for the talk, much appreciated. We're kind of going through at our company right now,
You and everybody else.
soul searching for DevOps and centralized tech and a whole host of improving our own workflow. I understand you have to get buy-in from the top, but if you were to look at the CEO and the CTO of, let's say, a mid-sized company, who do you think ultimately is the decider for that type of change and the biggest ally you need?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, I'm going to give you kind of a wussy answer, which is it depends. That said, not knowing anything about your circumstance, I would say that the two people that would be really interesting to try and convince first are your head of sales and your CFO. Why? Okay, head of sales, because the sales team needs to be willing to give the engineering team time to start making these changes, which could impact their feature velocity, right? But if you're able to convince the sales team that, hey, we're going to be so much better at supporting what you need when we're done, that's a huge advocate that's in your corner. CFO, the other way, we're going to be able to reduce the costs of what we're doing because of reasons, and they're going to be all over that, right? So I would say, knowing nothing else, if you can start there and at least hone your pitch, then they take that to the CEO and say, yeah, I think we're good with this, right?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Any more questions? Okay, great.
Cool.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
everyone.
much, Darryl. That's fascinating.